Nor did this content him. The staysails were set between the masts, and thus the Pilgrim was running along, crowded to the full, with all her canvas. The only additional sails which Dick could possibly have employed would have been some studding sails to larboard, but as the setting of these was a matter of some difficulty, and they were not always readily struck in the case of a sudden squall, he contented himself without them. Again he took his place at the helm. The breeze was manifestly freshening, and the Pilgrim, almost imperceptibly heeling to starboard, glided rapidly along the surface of the water, leaving behind her a wake, smooth and clean, that bore plain witness to the true adjustment of her waterline. "This is good progress, Mrs. Weldon," he said. "May heaven grant the wind and weather may continue thus favorable." The lady, in silence, shook the boy's hand, and then, worn out with the excitement of the past hours, went to her cabin, where she lay down and fell into a troubled doze. The new crew remained on watch. They were stationed on the forecastle, in readiness to make any alteration which the sails might require, but the wind was so steady and unshifting that no need arose for their services. And Cousin Benedict, all this time, where was he, and what had he been doing? He was sitting in his cabin. He had a magnifying glass in his hand and was studying an articulata of the order Orthoptera, an insect of the Blattidae family. Its characteristics are a roundish body, rather long wings, flat elytra, and a head hidden by the prothorax. He had been on deck at the time of the calamity. The ill-fated captain with the crew had been drowned before his very eyes. But he said nothing, not that he was unmoved. To think that he was not struck with horror would be to libel his kind and pitying nature. His sympathy was aroused, especially for his cousin. He pressed her hand warmly as if he would assure her of his truest commiseration, but he said nothing. He hurried off towards his cabin, and who shall deny that it was to devise some wonderfully energetic measures that he would take in consequence of this melancholy event. Passing the kitchen, however, he caught sight of Negoro in the act of crushing a blatta, an American species of cockroach. He broke out into a storm of invective, and in tones of indignation demanded the surrender of the insect, which Negoro made with cool contempt. In a moment, Captain Hull and his partners in death were all forgotten. The enthusiast had secured a prize with which he hastened to his own little compartment, where he was soon absorbed in proving to his own satisfaction, in opposition to the opinion of other entomologists, that the blatty of the Phoraspis species, which are remarkable for their colors, differ in their habits from blatty of the ordinary sort. For the remainder of the day perfect order reigned on board the Pilgrim. Though they were unable to shake off the sickening feeling of horror roused by the frightful disaster, and felt that they had sustained a startling shock, all the passengers seemed mechanically to fall into their usual routine. Dick Sands, though avowedly at the wheel, seemed to be everywhere, with an eye for everything, and his amateur crew obeyed him readily, and with the promptness of a willing activity. Negoro made no further overt attempt to question the young captain's authority, but remained shut up in his kitchen. Dick made no secret of his determination to place the cook in close confinement if he exhibited any. Illustration: Jack evidenced his satisfaction by giving his huge friend a hearty shake of the hand. Future sign of insubordination. Hercules was ready to carry him off bodily to the hold, and old Nan was equally ready to take his place in the cooking department. Probably Negoro was aware of all this. At any rate, he did not seem disposed to give any further cause of offense at present. As the day advanced, the wind continued to freshen, but no shifting of the sails seemed necessary. The Pilgrim was running well. There was no need to diminish her spread of canvas. Masts as solid and rigging as strong as hers could stand a far heavier breeze. As a general rule, it is deemed prudent in case of a squall to shorten sail at night, and especially to take in gallants and royal. But the weather prospects now were all so promising and satisfactory that Dick persuaded himself he was under no necessity to take this precaution. He rather felt himself bound to take the strongest measures he could to expedite his reaching less unfrequented waters. He made up his mind, however, not to leave the deck at all that night. The young captain made every effort to get an approximate reckoning of the schooner's progress. He heaved the log every half hour and duly registered the result of each successive examination. There were 2 compasses on board, one in the binnacle, close under the eye of the helmsman, the other, an inverted compass, being attached to the rafters of the captain's cabin, so that without leaving his berth, he could see whether the man in charge of the wheel was holding a proper course. Every vessel that is duly furnished for a lengthened voyage has always not only two compasses but two chronometers, one to correct the other. The Pilgrim was not deficient in this respect, and Dick Sands made a strong point of admonishing his crew that they should take especial care of the compasses, which under their present circumstances were of such supreme importance. A misfortune, however, was in store for them. On the night of the 12th, while Dick was on watch, the compass in the cabin became detached from its fastening and fell on the floor. The accident was not discovered until the following morning. Whether the metal ferrule that had attached the instrument to the rafters had become rusty, or whether it had been worn away by additional friction, it seemed impossible to settle. All that could be said was that the compass was broken beyond repair. Dick was extremely grieved at the loss, but he did not consider that anyone was to be blamed for the mishap, and could only resolve for the future to take extra care of the compass in the binnacle. With the exception of this contretemps, everything appeared to go on satisfactorily on board. Mrs. Weldon, reassured by Dick's confidence, had regained much of her wonted calmness, and was besides ever supported by a sincere religious spirit. She and Dick had many a long conversation together. The ingenuous lad was always ready to take the kind and intelligent lady into his counsel, and day by day would point out to her on the chart the registers he made as the result of his dead reckoning. He would then try and satisfy her that under the prevailing wind, there could be no doubt they must arrive at the coast of South America. Moreover, he said that, unless he was much mistaken, they should sight the land at no great distance from Valparaiso. Mrs. Weldon had, in truth, no reason to question the correctness of Dick's representations. She owned that provided the wind remained in the same favorable quarter, there was every prospect of their reaching land in safety. Nevertheless, at times, she could not resist the misgiving that would arise when she contemplated what might be the result of a change of wind or a breaking of the weather. With the lightheartedness that belonged to his age, Jack soon fell back into his accustomed pursuits, and was to be seen merrily running over the deck or romping with Dingo. At times, it is true, he missed the companionship of Dick, but his mother made him comprehend that now that Dick was captain, his time was too much occupied to allow him any leisure for play, and the child quite understood that he must not interrupt his old friend in his new duties. Illustration: a light shadow glided stealthily along the deck. The Negroes performed their work with intelligence, and seemed to make rapid progress in the art of seamanship. Tom had been unanimously appointed boatswain, and took one watch with Bat and Austin, the alternate watch being discharged by Dick himself with Hercules and Act Aeon. One of them steered so that the other two were free to watch at the bows. As a general rule, Dick Sands managed to remain at the wheel all night. 5 or 6 hours sleep in the daytime sufficed for him, and during the time when he was lying down, he entrusted the wheel to Tom or Bat, who under his instructions had become very fair helmsmen. Although in these unfrequented waters there was little chance of running foul of any other vessel, Dick invariably took the precaution of lighting his signals, carrying a green light to starboard and a red light to port. His exertions, however, were a great strain upon him, and sometimes during the night his fatigue would induce a heavy drowsiness, and he steered, as it were, by instinct more than by attention. On the night of the 13th, he was so utterly worn out that he was obliged to ask Tom to relieve him at the helm whilst he went down for a few hours' rest. Act Aeon and Hercules remained on watch on the forecastle. The night was very dark. The sky was covered with heavy clouds that had formed in the chill evening air, and the sails on the topmasts were lost in the obscurity. At the stern, the lamps on either side of the binnacle cast a faint reflection on the metal mountings of the wheel, leaving the deck generally in complete darkness. Towards 3 o'clock in the morning Tom was getting so heavy with sleepiness that he was almost unconscious. His eye, long fixed steadily on the compass, lost its power of vision, and he fell into a doze from which it would require more than a slight disturbance to arouse him. Meantime a light shadow glided stealthily along the deck. Creeping gradually up to the binnacle, Negoro put down something heavy that he had brought in his hand. He stole a keen and rapid glance at the dial of the compass, and made his way back, unseen and unheard as he had come. Almost immediately afterwards, Tom awakened from his slumber. His eye fell instinctively on the compass, and he saw in a moment that the ship was out of her proper course. By a turn of the helm he brought her head to what he supposed to be the east, but he was mistaken. During his brief interval of unconsciousness, a piece of iron had been deposited beneath the magnetic needle, which by this means had been diverted 30 degrees to the right, and instead of pointing due north, inclined far towards northeast. Consequently, it came to pass that the Pilgrim, supposed by her young commander to be making good headway due east, was in reality, under the brisk northwest breeze, speeding along towards the southeast. Chapter 11. Rough weather. During the ensuing week, nothing particular occurred on board. The breeze still freshened, and the Pilgrim made on the average 160 miles every 24 hours. The speed was as great as could be expected from a craft of her size. Dick grew more and more sanguine in his anticipations that it could not be long before the schooner would cross the track of the mail packets, plying between the eastern and western hemispheres. He had made up his mind to hail the first passing vessel, and either to transfer his passengers, or what perhaps would be better still, to borrow a few sailors, and it might be, an officer to work the Pilgrim to shore. He could not help, however, a growing sense of astonishment when day after day passed, and yet there was no ship to be signaled. He kept the most vigorous lookout, but all to no purpose. 3 voyages before had he made to the whale fisheries, and his experience made him sure that he ought now to be sighting some English or American vessel on its way between the equator and Cape Horn. Very different, however, was the true position of the Pilgrim from what Dick supposed. Not only had the ship been carried far out of her direct course by currents, the force of which there were no means of estimating, but from the moment when the compass had been tampered with by Negoro, the steering itself had put the vessel all astray. Unconscious of both these elements of disturbance, Dick Sands was convinced that they were proceeding steadily eastwards, and was perpetually encouraging Mrs. Weldon and himself by the assurance that they must very soon arrive within view of the American coast. Again and again, asserting that his sole concern was for his passengers, and that for his own safety he had no anxiety. "But think, Dick," said the lady, "what a position you would have been in if you had not had your passengers. You would have been alone with that terrible Negoro. You would have been rather alarmed then." "I should have taken good care to put it out of Negoro's power to do me any mischief, and then I should have worked the ship by myself," answered the lad stoutly. His very pluck gave Mrs. Weldon renewed confidence. She was a woman with wonderful powers of endurance, and it was only when she thought of her little son that she had any feeling of despair. Yet even this she endeavored to conceal, and Dick's undaunted courage helped her. Although the youth of the apprentice did not allow him to pretend to any advanced scientific knowledge, he had the proverbial weather eye of the sailor. He was not only very keen in noticing any change in the aspect of the sky, but he had learnt from Captain Hull, who was a clever meteorologist, to draw correct conclusions from the indications of the barometer. The captain, indeed, having taken the trouble to make him learn by heart the general rules, which are laid down in Vorpier's Dictionnaire Illustre. There are 7 of these rules. Not merely had Dick got these rules by rote, but he had tested them by his own observations, and had become singularly trustworthy in his forecasts of the weather. He made a point of consulting the barometer several times every day, and although to all appearances the sky indicated that the fine weather was settled, it did not escape his observation that on the 20th the mercury showed a tendency to fall. Dick knew that rain, if it came, would be accompanied by wind, an opinion in which he was very soon confirmed by the breeze freshening, till the air was displaced at the rate of nearly 60 feet a second, or more. Footnote 1. This and several of the other rules are concisely concentrated in the couplet. Long foretold, long last, short notice, soon past. Then 40 miles an hour, and he recognized the necessity of at once shortening sail. He had already used the precaution to take in the royal, the maintopsail, and the flying jib, but he now at once resolved likewise to take in the topgallant, and to have a couple of reefs in the foretopsail. To an inexperienced crew, the last operation was far from easy, but there was no symptom of shrinking from it. Followed by Bat and Austin, Dick mounted the rigging of the foremast, and with little trouble got to the topgallant. Had the weather been less unpromising, he would have been inclined to leave the 2 yards as they were, but anticipating the ultimate necessity of being obliged to lower the mast, he unrigged them, and let them down to the deck. He knew well enough that, in the event of the gale rising as he expected, the lowering of the mast as well as the shortening of sail would contribute to diminish the strain and stress upon the vessel. It was the work of 2 hours to get this preliminary operation over. There still remained the task of taking in the reefs in the topsail. The Pilgrim, in one respect, differed from most modern vessels. She did not carry a double foretop, which would very much have diminished the difficulty attending the reefing. It was consequently necessary to proceed as before, to mount the rigging by main force to haul in the flapping canvas, and to make the fastening secure. But critical and dangerous as the task was, it was successfully accomplished, and the 3 young men, having descended safely to the deck, had the satisfaction of seeing the schooner run easily before the wind, which had further increased till it was blowing a stiff gale. For 3 days the gale continued brisk and hard, yet without any variation in its direction. But all along the barometer was falling, the mercury sank to 28 degrees without symptom of recovery. The sky was becoming overcast. Clouds, thick and lowering, obscured the sun, and it was difficult to make out where it rose or where it set. Dick did his best to keep up his courage, but he could not disguise. Illustration: for half an hour Negoro stood motionless. From himself that there was cause for uneasiness. He took no more rest than was absolutely necessary, and what repose he allowed himself he always took on deck. He maintained a calm exterior, but he was really tortured with anxiety. Although the violence of the wind seemed to lull a while, Dick did not suffer himself to be betrayed into any false security. He knew only too well what to expect, and after a brief interval of comparative quiet, the gale returned, and the waves began to run very high. About 4 o'clock one afternoon, Negoro, a most unusual thing for him, emerged from his kitchen and skulked to the fore. Dingo was fast asleep, and did not make his ordinary growl by way of greeting to his enemy. For half an hour Negoro stood motionless, apparently surveying the horizon. The heavy waves rolled past. They were higher than the condition of the wind warranted, their magnitude witness to a storm passing in the west, and there was every reason to suspect that the Pilgrim might be caught by its violence. Negoro looked long at the water. He then raised his eyes and scanned the sky. Above and below he might have read threatening signs. The upper stratum of cloud was traveling far more rapidly than that beneath, an indication that ere long the masses of vapor would descend, and, coming in contact with the inferior current, would change the gale into a tempest, which probably would increase to a hurricane. It might be from ignorance or it might be from indifference, but there was no indication of alarm on the face of Negoro. On the other hand, there might be seen a sort of smile curling on his lip. After thus gazing above him and around him, he clambered on to the bowsprit, and made his way by degrees to the very gammonings. Again he rested and looked about him as if to explore the horizon. After a while he clambered back on deck, and soon stealthily retreated to his own quarters. No doubt there was much to cause concern in the general aspect of the weather, but there was one point on which they never failed to congratulate each other, that the direction of the wind had never changed, and consequently must be carrying them in the desired course. Unless a storm should overtake them, they could continue their present navigation without peril, and with every prospect of finding a port upon the shore where they might put in. Such were their mutual and acknowledged hopes, but Dick secretly felt the misgiving lest, without a pilot, he might in his ignorance fail to find a harbor of refuge. Nevertheless, he would not suffer himself to meet trouble halfway, and kept up his spirits under the conviction that if difficulties came he should be strengthened to grapple with them or make his escape. Time passed on, and the 9th of March arrived without material change in the condition of the atmosphere. The sky remained heavily burdened, and the wind, which occasionally had abated for a few hours, had always returned with at least its former violence. The occasional rising of the mercury never encouraged Dick to anticipate a permanent improvement in the weather, and he discerned only too plainly that brighter times at present were not to be looked for. A startling alarm had more than once been caused by the sudden breaking of storms, in which thunderbolts had seemed to fall within a few cables' lengths of the schooner. On these occasions, the torrents of rain had been so heavy that the ship had appeared to be in the very midst of a whirlpool of vapor, and it was impossible to see a yard ahead. The Pilgrim pitched and rolled frightfully. Fortunately, Mrs. Weldon could bear the motion without much personal inconvenience, and consequently was able to devote her attention to her little boy, who was a miserable sufferer. Cousin Benedict was as undisturbed as the cockroaches he was investigating. He hardly noticed the increasing madness of either wind or wave, but went on with his studies as calmly as if he were in his own comfortable museum at San Francisco. Moreover, it was fortunate that the Negroes did not suffer to any great degree from seasickness, and consequently were able to assist their captain in his arduous task. Dick was far too experienced a sailor himself to be inconvenienced by any oscillations of the vessel, however violent. The Pilgrim still made good headway, and Dick, although he was aware that ultimately it would probably be necessary again to shorten sail, was anxious to postpone making any alteration before he was absolutely obliged. Surely, he reasoned with himself, the land could not now be far away. He had calculated his speed. He had kept a diligent reckoning on the chart. Surely, the shore must be almost in sight. He would not trust his crew to keep watch. He was aware how easily their inexperienced eyes would be misled, and how they might mistake a distant cloudbank for the land they coveted to see. He kept watch for himself. His own gaze was ever fixed upon the horizon, and in the eagerness of his expectation, he would repeatedly mount to the crosstrees to get a wider range of vision. But land was not to be seen. Next day, as Dick was standing at the bow, alternately considering the canvas which his ship carried and the aspect presented by the sky, Mrs. Weldon approached him without his noticing her. She caught some muttered expressions of bewilderment that fell from his lips and asked him whether he could see anything. He lowered the telescope which he had been holding in his hand, and answered, "No, Mrs. Weldon, I cannot see anything, and it is this high it perplexes me so sorely. I cannot understand why we have not already come in sight of land. It is nearly a month since we lost our poor dear captain. There has been no delay in our progress, no stoppage in our rate of speed. I cannot make it out. How far were we from land when we lost the captain? I am sure I am not far out in saying that we were scarcely more than 4,500 miles from the shores of America. And at what rate have we been sailing? Not much less than 90 knots a day. How long, then, do you reckon, Dick, we ought to be in arriving at the coast?" "Under 26 days, replied Dick. He paused before he spoke again, then added, "But what mystifies me even more than our failing to sight the land is this: we have not come across a single vessel, and yet vessels without number are always traversing these seas." "But do you not think," inquired Mrs. Weldon, "that you have made some error in your reckoning? Is your speed really what you have supposed?" "Impossible, madam," replied Dick with an air of dignity. "Impossible that I should have fallen into error. The log has been consulted, without fail, every half-hour. I am about to have it lowered now, and I will undertake to show you that we are at this present moment making 10 miles an hour, which would give considerably over 200 miles a day." He then called out to Tom, "Tom, lower the log." The old man was quite accustomed to the duty. The log was fastened to the line and thrown overboard. It ran out regularly for about 25 fathoms, when all at once the line slackened in Tom's hand. "It is broken," cried Tom, "the cord is broken." "Broken!" exclaimed Dick. "Good heavens, we have lost the log." It was too true, the log was gone. Tom drew in the rope. Dick took it up and examined it. It had not broken at its point of union with the log. It had given way in the middle, at a place where the strands in some unaccountable way had worn strangely thin. Dick's agony of mind, in spite of his effort to be calm, was intensely great. A suspicion of foul play involuntarily occurred to him. He knew that the rope had been of first-rate make. He knew that it had been quite sound when used before, but he could prove nothing. He could only mourn over the loss which committed him to the sole remaining compass as his only guide. That compass, too, although he knew it not, was misleading him entirely. Mrs. Weldon sighed as she witnessed the grief which the loss manifestly caused poor Dick, but in purest sympathy she said nothing, and retired thoughtfully to her cabin. It was no longer possible to reckon the rate of progress, but there was no doubt that the Pilgrim continued to maintain at least her previous speed. Before another 24 hours had passed, the barometer had fallen still lower, and the wind was threatening to rise to a velocity of 60 miles. Resolved to be on the safe side, Dick determined not only to strike the topgallant and the maintopmast, but to take in all the lower sails. Indeed, he began to be aware that no time was to be lost. The operation would not be done in a moment, and the storm was approaching. Dick made Tom take the helm. He ascended the shrouds with Bat, Austin, and Act Aeon, making Hercules stay on deck to slacken the halyards as required. By dint of arduous exertion, and at no little risk of being thrown overboard by the rolling of the ship, they succeeded in lowering the two masts. The foretopsail was then reefed, and the foresail entirely struck, so that the only canvas that the schooner carried was the reefed foretop and the one stay. These, however, made her run with a terrific speed. Early on the morning of the 12th, Dick noted with alarm that the barometer had not ceased to fall, and now registered only 27.9 degrees. The tempest had continued to increase, till it was unsafe for the ship to carry any canvas at all. The order was given for the topsail to be taken in, but it was too late. A violent gust carried the sail completely away, and Austin, who had made his way to the foretop-yard, was struck by the flying sheet, and although he was not seriously hurt, he was obliged at once to return to deck. Dick Sands became more uneasy than ever. He was tortured by apprehensions of reefs outlying the shore, to which he imagined he must now be close. But he could discern no rocks to justify his fears, and returned to take his place at the helm. The next moment Negoro appeared on deck. He pointed mysteriously to the far-off horizon, as though he discerned some object as a mountain there, and looking round with a malevolent smile, immediately left the deck and went back to his cabin. Illustration, under bare poles. Chapter 12. Hope revived. The wind had now increased to a hurricane. It had veered to the southwest, and had attained a velocity little short of 90 miles an hour. On land, the most substantial of erections could with difficulty have withstood its violence, and a vessel anchored in a roadstead must have been torn from its moorings and cast ashore. The memorable storm that had devastated the island of Guadeloupe on the 25th of July, 1825, when heavy cannon were lifted from their carriages, could scarcely have been more furious, and it was only her mobility before the blast and the solidity of her structure that gave the Pilgrim a hope of surviving the tempest. A few minutes after the topsail had been lost, the small jib was carried away. Dick Sands contemplated the possibility of throwing out a storm jib made of extra strong canvas as a means of bringing the ship a little more under his control, but abandoned the idea as useless. It was therefore under bare poles that the Pilgrim was driven along, but in spite of the lack of canvas, the hull, masts, and rigging gave sufficient purchase to the wind, and the progress of the schooner was prodigiously rapid. Sometimes, indeed, she seemed to be literally lifted from the water and scudded on, scarcely skimming its surface. The rolling was fearful. Enormous waves followed in quick succession, and as they traveled faster than the ship, there was the perpetual risk of one of them catching her astern. Without sail, there were no means of escaping that peril by increase of speed. The adroit management of the helm was the only chance of avoiding the hazardous shocks, and even this repeatedly failed. To prevent his being washed overboard, Dick lashed himself to his place at the wheel by a rope round his waist, and made Tom and Bat keep close at hand, ready to give him assistance in case of emergency. Hercules and Act Aeon, clinging to the bit, kept watch at the bow. Mrs. Weldon and her party, at Dick's special request, remained inside the stern cabin, although the lady, for her own part, would much rather have stayed on deck. She had, however, yielded to the representation that she would thus be exposing herself to unnecessary danger. The hatchways were hermetically closed, and it was to be hoped that they would withstand the heavy sea that was dashing over them. Only let one of them give way to the pressure, and the vessel must inevitably fill and founder. It was a matter of congratulation that the stowage had been done very carefully, so that notwithstanding all the lurchings of the ship, the cargo did not shift in the least. The heroic young commander had still further curtailed his periods of rest, and it was only at the urgent entreaty of Mrs. Weldon, who feared that he would exhaust himself by his vigilance, that he was induced to lie down for a few hours' sleep on the night of the 13th. After Tom and Bat had been left alone at the wheel, they were, somewhat to their surprise, joined by Negoro, who very rarely came aft. He seemed inclined to enter into conversation, but found little encouragement to talk on the part either of Tom or his son. All at once, a violent roll of the ship threw him off his feet, and he would have gone overboard if he had not been saved by falling against the binnacle. Old Tom was in a frantic state of alarm lest the compass should be broken. He uttered a cry of consternation so loud that it roused Dick from the light slumber into which he had fallen in the cabin, and he rushed to the deck. By the time he had reached the stern, Negoro had not only regained his feet, but had managed successfully to conceal. Illustration. Quick as lightning, Dick Sands drew a revolver from his pocket. The bit of iron which he had again extracted from beneath the binnacle where he had himself laid it. Now that the wind had shifted to the southwest, it suited his machinations that the magnetic needle should indicate its true direction. "How now?" asked Dick eagerly. "What is the meaning of all this noise?" Tom explained how the cook had fallen against the binnacle, and how he had been terrified lest the compass should be injured. Dick's heart sank at the thought of losing his sole remaining compass, and his anxiety betrayed itself in his countenance as he knelt down to examine its condition. But he breathed freely as he ascertained that the instrument had sustained no damage. By the dim light, he saw the needle resting on its two concentric circles, and felt his fears at once relieved. Of course, he was quite unconscious of the fact that the removal of the bit of iron had made the magnet change its pointing. The incident, however, excited his misgiving. Although he felt that Negoro could not be held responsible for an accidental fall, the very presence of the man in such a place at such a time perplexed him. "And what brings you here this hour of the night?" he asked. "That's not your business," retorted Negoro insolently. "It is my business," replied Dick resolutely, "and I mean to have an answer. What brought you here?" Negoro answered sullenly that he knew of no rule to prevent his going where he liked, and when he liked. "No rule?" cried Dick. "Then I make the rule now. From this time forward I make the rule that you shall never come astern. Do you understand?" Roused from his accustomed doggedness, the man seemed to make a threatening movement. Quick as lightning, Dick Sands drew a revolver from his pocket. "Negoro, one act, one word of insubordination, and I blow out your brains." Negoro had no time to reply. Before he could speak, he was bowed down towards the deck by an irresistible weight. Hercules had grasped him by the shoulder. "Shall I put him overboard, Captain? He will make a meal for the fishes. They are not very particular what they eat," said the Negro, with a grin of contempt. "Not yet," quietly answered Dick. The giant removed his hand, and Negoro stood upright again, and began to retreat to his own quarters, muttering, however, as he passed Hercules, "You cursed nigger, you shall pay for this." The discovery was now made that the wind apparently had taken a sudden shift of no less than 45 degrees. But what occasioned Dick the greatest perplexity was that there was nothing in the condition of the sea to correspond with the alteration in the current of the air. Instead of being directly astern, wind and waves were now beating on the larboard. Progress in this way must necessarily be full of danger, and Dick was obliged to bring his ship up at least 4 points before he got her straight before the tempest. The young captain felt that he must be more than ever on the alert. He could not shake off the suspicion that Negoro had been concerned in the loss of the first compass, and had some further designs upon the second. Still, he was utterly at a loss to imagine what possible motive the man could have for so criminal an act of malevolence, as there was no plausible reason to be assigned why he should not be as anxious as all the rest to reach the coast of America. The suspicion continued, however, to haunt him, and when he mentioned it to Mrs. Weldon, he found that a similar feeling of distrust had agitated her, although she, like himself, was altogether unable to allege a likely motive why the cook should contemplate so strange an act of mischief. It was determined that a strict surveillance should be kept upon all the fellow's movements. Negoro, however, manifested no inclination to disobey the captain's peremptory order. He kept strictly to his own part of the ship. But as Dingo was now regularly quartered on the stern, there was a tolerably sure guarantee that the cook would not be found wandering much in that direction. A week passed, and still the tempest showed no signs of abating. The barometer continued to fall, and not once did a period of calmer weather afford an opportunity of carrying sail. The Pilgrim still made her way northeast. Her speed could not be less than 200 miles in 24 hours, but no land appeared. Vast as was the range of the American continent, extending for 120 degrees between the Atlantic and the Pacific, it was nowhere to be discerned. Was he dreaming? Was he mad? Dick would perpetually ask himself. Had he been sailing in a wrong direction? Had he failed to steer aright? But no, he was convinced there was no error in his steering. Although he could not actually see it for the mist, he knew that day after day the sun rose before him, and that it set behind him. Yet he was constrained in bewilderment to ask, what had become of those shores of America upon which, when they came in sight, there was only too great a fear the ship should be dashed. What had become of them? Where were they? Whither had this incessant hurricane driven them? Why did not the expected coast appear? To all these bewildering inquiries Dick could find no answer except to imagine that his compass had misled him. Yet he was powerless to put his own misgivings to the test. He deplored more than ever the destruction of the duplicate instrument which would have checked his registers. He studied his chart, but all in vain. The position in which he found himself as the result of Negoro's treachery seemed to baffle him the more he tried to solve the mystery. The days were passing on in this chronic state of anxiety, when one morning about 8 o'clock, Hercules, who was on watch at the fore, suddenly shouted, "Land!" Dick Sands had little reliance upon the Negro's inexperienced eye, but hurried forward to the bow. "Where's the land?" he cried, his voice being scarcely audible above the howling of the tempest. "There, look there," said Hercules, nodding his head and pointing over the larboard side to the northeast. Dick could see nothing. Mrs. Weldon had heard the shout. Unable to restrain her interest, she had left her cabin and was at Dick's side. He uttered an expression of surprise at seeing her, but could not hear anything she said, as her voice was unable to rise above the roaring of the elements. She stood, her whole being as it were concentrated in the power of vision, and scanned the horizon in the direction indicated by Hercules. But all to no purpose. Suddenly, however, after a while Dick raised his hand. "Yes," he said, "yes, sure enough, yonder is land." He clung with excitement to the netting, and Mrs. Weldon, supported by Hercules, strained her eyes yet more vehemently to get a glimpse of a shore which she had begun to despair of ever reaching. Beyond a doubt an elevated peak was there. It must be about 10 miles to leeward. A break in the clouds soon left it more distinct. Some promontory it must be upon the American coast. Without sails, of course, the Pilgrim had no chance of bearing down direct upon it, but at least there was every reason to believe that she would soon reach some other portion of the shore. Perhaps before noon, certainly in a few hours, they must be close to land. The pitching of the ship made it impossible for Mrs. Weldon to keep safe footing on the deck. Accordingly, at a sign from Dick, Hercules led her back again to her cabin. Dick did not remain long at the bow, but went thoughtfully back to the wheel. He had indeed a tremendous responsibility before him. Here was the land for which they had longed so eagerly, and now that their anticipations were on the point of being realized, what was there, with a hurricane driving them on towards it, to prevent that land being their destruction? What measures could he take to prevent the schooner being dashed to pieces against it? Illustration, there, look there. At the very moment when the promontory was just abreast of them, Negoro appeared on deck. He nodded to the peak familiarly, as he might have saluted a familiar friend, and retired as stealthily as he had come. 2 hours later, and the promontory was lying to the larboard wake. Dick Sands had never relaxed his watchfulness, but he had failed to discover any further indications of a coastline. His perplexity could only increase. The horizon was clear, the Andes ought to be distinct, they would be conspicuous 20 miles or more away. Dick took up his telescope again and again. He scrutinized the eastern horizon with minutest care, but there was nothing to be seen, and as the afternoon waned away the last glimpse had been taken of the promontory that had awakened their expectation. It had vanished utterly from their gaze. No indication of shore could be seen from the Pilgrim's deck. Dick Sands uttered a sigh of mingled amazement and relief. He went into Mrs. Weldon's cabin, where she was standing with her party. "It was only an island," he said, "only an island." "How, why, what island, what do you mean?" cried Mrs. Weldon incredulously. "What island can it be?" "The chart perhaps will tell us," replied Dick, and hurrying off to his own cabin, he immediately returned with the chart in his hands. After studying it attentively for a few minutes, he said, "There, Mrs. Weldon, the land we have just passed, I should suppose must be that little speck in the midst of the Pacific. It must be Easter Island. At least, there seems to be no other land which possibly it could be." "And do you say," inquired Mrs. Weldon, "that we have left it quite behind us?" "Yes, entirely, almost to windward." Mrs. Weldon commenced a searching scrutiny of the map that was outspread before her. "How far is this?" she said, after bending a considerable time over the chart. "How far is this from the coast of America?" 35 degrees, answered Dick. Somewhere about 2,500 miles. Whatever do you mean? Rejoined the lady astonished. If the Pilgrim is sent miles from shore, she has positively made no progress at all. Impossible. In thoughtful perplexity, Dick passed his hand across his brow. He did not know what to say. After an interval of silence, he said, I have no account to give for the strange delay. It is inexplicable to myself, except upon that one hypothesis, which I cannot resist, that the readings of the compass, somehow or other, have been wrong. He relapsed into silence. Then, brightening up, he added, But thank God, at least we have now the satisfaction of knowing where we really are. We are no longer lost upon the wide Pacific. If only this hurricane will cease, long as the distance seems, we are on our proper course to the shores of America. The tone of confidence with which the youthful captain spoke had the effect of inspiring new hope into all who heard him. Their spirits rose, and to their sanguine mood, it seemed as if they were approaching to the end of all their troubles, and had hardly more to do than to await the turning of a tide to bring them into a glad proximity to port. Easter Island, of which the true name is Vaihu, was discovered by David in 1686 and visited by Cook and Laprouse. It lies in lat. 27 degrees S and long. 112 E. Consequently, it was evident that during the raging of the hurricane the schooner had been driven northwards no less than 15 degrees. Far away, however, as she was from shore, the wind could hardly fail within 10 days to carry her within sight of land. And then, if the storm had worn itself out, as probably it would, the Pilgrim would again hoist sail and make her way into some port with safety. Anyhow, the discovery of his true position restored a spirit of confidence to Dick Sands, and he anticipated the time when he should no longer be drifting helplessly before the storm. To say the truth, the Pilgrim had suffered very little from the prolonged fury of the weather. The damage she had sustained was limited to the loss of the topsail and the small jib, which could be easily replaced. The caulking of the seams remained thoroughly sound, and no drop of water had found its way into the hold. The pumps, too, were perfectly free. Dick Sands did not fear for the stability of his ship. His only anxiety was lest the weather should not moderate in time. Only let the wind subside, and the schooner once more would be under his control. But he never forgot that the ordering of the winds and waves were in the hands of the great disposer of all. Chapter 13. Land at last. It was not long before Dick's sanguine expectations were partially realized, for on the very next day, which was the 27th, the barometer began to rise, not rapidly, but steadily, indicating that its elevation would probably continue. The sea remained exceedingly rough, but the violence of the wind, which had veered slightly towards the west, had perceptibly diminished. The tempest had passed its greatest fury and was beginning to wear itself out. Not a sail, however, could yet be hoisted. The smallest show of canvas would have been carried away in an instant. Nevertheless, Dick hoped that before another 24 hours were over, the Pilgrim might be able to carry a storm jib. In the course of the night, the wind moderated still more, and the pitching of the ship had so far diminished that the passengers began to reappear on deck. Mrs. Weldon was the first to leave her enforced imprisonment. She was anxious to speak to Dick, whom she might have expected to find looking pale and wan after his almost superhuman exertions and loss of sleep. But she was mistaken. However much the lad might suffer from the strain in after years, at present he exhibited no symptoms of failing energy. "Well, Captain Dick, how are you?" she said, as she advanced towards him holding out her hand. Dick smiled. "You call me Captain, Mrs. Weldon," he answered, "but you do not seem disposed to submit implicitly to illustration. You have acquitted yourself like a man." "Captain's orders. Did I not direct you to keep to your cabin?" "You did," replied the lady, "but observing how much the storm had abated, I could not resist the temptation to disobey you." "Yes, madam, the weather is far more promising. The barometer has not fallen since yesterday morning, and I really trust the worst is over now." "Thank heaven," she replied, and after a few moments' silence she added, "But now, Dick, you must really take some rest. You may perhaps not know how much you require it, but it is absolutely necessary." "Rest?" the boy repeated. "Rest? I want no rest. I have only done my duty, and it will be time enough for me to concern myself about my own rest when I have seen my passengers in a place of safety." "You have acquitted yourself like a man," said Mrs. Weldon, "and you may be assured that my husband, like myself, will never forget the services you have rendered me. I shall urge upon him the request which I am sure he will not refuse, that you shall have your studies completed, so that you may be made a captain for the firm." Tears of gratitude rose to Dick's eyes. He deprecated the praise that was lavished upon him, but rejoiced in the prospect that seemed opening upon his future. Mrs. Weldon assured him that he was dear as a son to her, and pressed a gentle kiss upon his forehead. The lad felt that he was animated, if need be, to yet greater hardships in behalf of his benefactors, and resolved to prove himself even more worthy of their confidence. By the 29th, the wind had so far moderated that Dick thought he might increase the Pilgrim's speed by hoisting the foresail and topsail. "Now, my men, I have some work for you today," he said to the negroes when he came on deck at daybreak. "All right, Captain," answered Hercules. "We are growing rusty for want of something to do." "Why didn't you blow with your big mouth?" said little Jack. "You could have beaten the wind all to nothing." Dick laughed and said, "Not a bad idea, Jack. If ever we get becalmed, we must get Hercules to blow into the sails." "I shall be most happy," retorted the giant, and he inflated his huge cheeks till he was the very impersonation of Boreas himself. "But now to work," cried Dick. "We have lost our topsail, and we must contrive to hoist another. Not an easy matter, I can tell you."